Okay, so for the next two sections of the video, what I'm going to try to do is kind of cover both theaters of the war relatively quickly and succinctly. Again, it's not something that's going to be heavily tested, but it does need, to be a part of your knowledge in terms of World War II. So if you're going to kind of glance over or glaze over any part of the lecture, this section and the next section will probably be the ones to do that on. Anyway, so let's start with the war in Asia. So the war in Asia has some very deep-rooted causes. And again, a lot of them go back to imperialism in the 18th century and 19th century, right? So in Japan, even though they embrace a lot of parts of Western culture, they embrace a lot of Western modernization, they embrace a lot of industrialization, there is still a very deep rooted embarrassment and anger at the West, especially the United States. In terms of the Pacific Ocean, with the decline of China over the 1900s, Japan's real rival in the Pacific Ocean becomes the United States, who is becoming a larger and larger power after World War I and expanding further and further west. So there are deep-seated feelings of resentment and anger at the United States, as well as um, lingering racism against Asians and Japanese by the West, even after the Japanese have proved themselves to be more than competent in defeating the Chinese and the Russians in the early 1900s. But Japan also has a supply problem, similar to the problem that the states of Western Europe had at the beginning of industrialization. There's not a ton of land in Japan, and the land in Japan is not particularly loaded with resources. So the Japanese desperately need to expand their territory in order to supply their expanding population, right? And then kind of the final straw in this puzzle is the Japanese heavily resent their treatment at the end of World War One. The Japanese fought on behalf of the Allies in World War One, thanks to their alliance with Great Britain. However, when it came time to negotiate the Versailles Treaty that ended World War One, the majority of the treaty is dominated by the big three of Great Britain, France, and the United States. And the Japanese and the Italians are essentially treated like, children at Thanksgiving, where they have to go and sit at the little kids' table. They're really not given much of a say in how things happen, and the big three kind of dictate how things are going to go to them. So all of these feelings of resentment, mistreatment, as well as the Japanese need for land and resources leads to a pretty aggressive campaign of expansion by the Japanese military in the 1920s and the 1930s. So they embark upon this massive conquest all throughout East Asia. And thanks to their ability to industrialize and modernize, similar to the people of Western Europe, the Japanese see other Asian nations and other Asian peoples as uncivilized and in need of enlightenment, the way that the Japanese were in need of enlightenment in the last half of the 1800s. So this creates the idea of a new Asian order, an all Asian empire headed by the Japanese, free of Western interference and Western influence. So in the early 1920s, the Japanese very brutally conquer the islands of Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula. And you see in Korea and Taiwan the beginnings of the brutality that's going to mark World War II. The Japanese perform mass executions. There is large scale sexual enslavement of the female population, as well as just general violence and essentially slave labor of the male population, right? So already before the war technically even starts, there is widespread brutality on a racial and an ethnic scale. And that's simply going to increase as the war goes on. Now, You could technically say that World War II begins in 1931 with the Japanese army invading Manchuria. I know a lot of people mark the German invasion of Poland. Some people mark Pearl Harbor as the official start, but all of these dates are kind of debatable. But in 1931, the Japanese, who have their eyes on China, stage what's known as the Mukden incident. Basically, what happens is the Japanese army blows up one of its own train stations, and they hire Chinese actors and put them in Chinese army uniforms and then capture them and put them on trial and actually hang them, which the Chinese actors didn't expect was coming, as war criminals. And they use this incident to justify a full scale invasion of China in 1937. So in 1931, they invade and conquer the northern part of the what used to be the Qing dynasty, Manchuria, and then in 1937 they invade the Chinese homeland proper. And again, because of the ethnic and the racial aspect of this war, the brutality from Taiwan and Korea extends well into China, especially the capture of Nanking, which had been the former capital of the Qing dynasty. And we'll talk more about the rape of Nanking later on. So within a matter of a few years, large areas within China are under Japanese control. By 1940, the Japanese began expanding beyond China. They attack the British and French colonies in Vietnam, Burma, and Indonesia, and basically overrun the British and the French. And they begin planning an invasion of Australia and New Zealand as well. Now, as the Japanese are expanding and as the Japanese are ramping up their aggression, the other major power in the Pacific Ocean, the United States, begins to feel that its own interests in the Pacific Ocean and East Asia are going to be threatened by this. Because if you remember, the United States has a rather large colony in the Philippines, due south of mainland Japan. And part of their concern is that the Japanese will eventually come for the Philippines the way that they came for Vietnam and the rest of East Asia. So the Japanese and the US sit down to negotiate. Basically, the United States demands that the Japanese return to their 1937 borders, basically saying to the Japanese, listen, you can have Manchuria, you can have Korea, you can have Taiwan, but you have to evacuate Southeast Asia and return it to the British and French, and you have to evacuate China. Naturally, Japan, seeing the hypocrisy in a Western nation telling them that they can't expand their colonies or their territory in Asia, refuses. So the United States, not wanting to go to war, begins to flex its economic muscles against Japan. And it imposes an embargo on two very important items: scrap iron in 1939, which is essential for making steel, which Japan has very little of, and oil in 1941. Now, these are the lifeblood of the Japanese military. Without steel and without oil, the Japanese army comes to a halt, right? So the Japanese have essentially a decision to make. Do they continue their expansion? Do they continue to follow their dreams of this all Asian empire? Or do they bow under the economic pressure from the United States, which would be a national embarrassment of horrific scale, especially when you consider the fact that the opening of isolated Japan back in 1865 was again at the hands of the United States. So basically, the Japanese people would be accepting American dominance over them and over the Pacific Ocean. So the Japanese, again, refuse this, and their response is the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And so this plunges the United States into war in the Pacific. Basically, over the next 4 years, the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marines slowly island hop towards the Japanese homeland. And because of the strategy used here, this island hopping strategy, which essentially boiled down to isolating islands that had Japanese bases or troops on them, encircling the island, cutting off the flow of supplies to the island, and then slowly but surely wearing down the Japanese defenses on the island. Um, this brings a huge importance to naval warfare. And so, using newly developed aircraft carriers and newly developed um, sea-based technologies, the United States and its allies are able to gradually move along the string of Pacific islands further and further northward toward Japan, right? So by 1945, the US Navy and the US Marines have reached a point where the Japanese homeland is within reach. However, by their best estimates, because the Japanese are known for fighting to the absolute last man, because they are known for committing what's known as kamikaze or suicide attacks, where pilots would fly planes directly into American ships, or Japanese troops would strap themselves with explosives or grenades and run into American lines. The estimates of the War Department are that an invasion of the Japanese homeland would kill or wound somewhere around or even more than 1 million American soldiers, which at that point was somewhere around 40% of the entire US military. Um, so, in order to prevent a costly invasion, the US Navy and the US Army basically open up a whole new page in warfare. And this is the dawn of the nuclear age in war. So the United States Navy drops two atomic bombs, first on Hiroshima and then the second on Nagasaki in 1945. And this causes Japan to give their unconditional surrender on the 15th of August. Right. So this map kind of breaks down the entirety of the war in the Pacific. You can see here what I mean by the island hopping strategy over the 4 year period. Basically, the United States used its aircraft carriers to move in between island chains. It would use naval aircraft and naval aviation to surround the island, cut off all access to the island, and essentially starve the Japanese troops on those islands into submission before the Marines would then go in and capture the island. Um, and then eventually, like you said, in 1945, the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki bring everything to an end.